honestly, Phil, thank you so much for chatting with me. I'm really excited about this one.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Phil Hall is the author of Jesus Christ Movie Star, which is currently available. Is it out on Amazon? Can you get it on Amazon?
It's on Amazon, all the e-commerce sites. I just discovered today that the Target department store chain actually has it on its Pinterest page. So
Oh,
they've pinned my book up on Pinterest.
oh, there you go. That's great. Congratulations. Uh,
Thank you.
and this is a really unique book and unique conversation because we've seen books about faith in the arts before, but this one is specifically about just the broad many depictions about Jesus that have been on screen from when the outset of the film industry. I was wondering where did the idea for this book come from?
Well, the idea came from a book that was never written. I was supposed to be doing a book on Pilate's wife, who is commonly known as Claudia Procula, although that is not how she's identified in the Gospel of Mark. She has no name in the Gospel. In fact, she's only in one sentence. Uh, I decided not to pursue that book because I'm not known as a religious scholar. I'm primarily known as a film writer. I'm also somewhat well known as a business writer. And I figured that if I was going to devote so much time to writing a work of religious scholarship, there's a good chance it wouldn't be published because nobody knows me for that pursuit. But while I was doing the research into Pilate's wife, I realized there was an awful lot of films where she was included, even though she is a very, very minor figure in the life story of Jesus. And it sort of dawned on me that there might be a better book in how the cinema has depicted the adult Jesus. Uh, Jesus has probably been the most filmed person in movie history. The very early films from the 1890s, there were many of them about Jesus. And even as recently as now, Terrence Malick is at work on a film on the subject. So uh, filmmakers have never lost their interest in this topic.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, this is going back 130 years. This book is, as you said. What is it about Jesus per se that keeps drawing us back to him as a cinematic subject? Why is he a story that we keep going back to?
Well, for one, it's a very familiar subject, and that helped in the early days of the silent movies, when a great many people in the movie-going audience were not either literate or they were not cognizant of many great works of literature, but they knew the story of Jesus. So in selling it from a commercial aspect, that was very easy. But over time, filmmakers have come up with their own idiosyncratic interpretations of Jesus, his ministry in ancient Judea, and where Jesus figures into contemporary society. We can even trace this as far back as 1916 with Thomas Ince's film Civilization, which took Jesus out of the Bible and actually put him in a contemporary story, which in this case was a pacifist epic arguing against a potential world war, which it, of course, wasn't very successful. But uh, over the years, we've had as many interpretations of Jesus as you can imagine, very solemn, very sincere. We've had comical Jesus, we've had singing and dancing Jesus, we've had naked Jesus in skin flicks. We've had Jesus being plopped into various situations as profound as anti-war diatribes in Dalton Trumbo's Johnny Got His Gun, with Donald Sutherland playing Jesus, as well as very unlikely situations, such as a movie short from 2000 called Jesus and Hutch, with Eric Stoltz playing Jesus in a 70s cop style situation, where he gives a very different meaning to criminals about what it is to turn the other cheek, a good right to the jaw. So, I mean, there are so many ways to tell the story of Jesus, and they haven't been fully plumbed, actually, which is why films on the subject are still being made.
What's fascinating to me too is that when you hear we're making a film on the story of Jesus, you might assume that it would be a primarily faith-based approach, that that this is something that, oh well, this is the primary interest in making the story. But that's not the case. Whether it's people inside the church or outside the church, they're constantly fascinated and looking at Jesus in different ways, which I think is so interesting. And I was wondering, for you, is there a significant factor in the ever evolving picture of Jesus on screen? Is it just the change of culture? Is it the individual? What is it that keeps that shifting?
It's a reflection of the times. We have, for some years, Jesus was not actually seen on the screen, particularly from the beginning of the sound era in films, because a lot of filmmakers were hesitant or worse about having a walking, talking Jesus. The silent films, it wasn't that bad because there was no soundtrack, so people could imagine what Jesus would have sounded like. But once a microphone comes into the picture, Jesus is all of a sudden defined by his accent. And are you going to have someone with a British accent, with a Brooklyn accent, with a French accent? So for a while, filmmakers didn't touch the subject, and film studios just dusted off the old silent films, put synchronized music scores on, and put them back into theaters. And they made some money, but this couldn't go on for a very long time. Uh, into the 1960s, and maybe it was obviously a reflection of that era where there were challenges to authority, and we suddenly see Jesus being depicted in a very different way. Robert Frank's Sin of Jesus from 1961, he does not look like the long-haired, bearded fellow that you'd see in the Renaissance paintings. He was clean-shaven, his hair was relatively short, and his behavior was, quite frankly, not very holy. Something like that could not have been made as much as 5 or 6 years earlier, but because it was 1961, it was a bit of a looser situation. And then, of course, Pasolini's Gospel According to St. Matthew, we have a rather surly Jesus who was behaving in a zealot manner, which had not been seen before on the screen. And then, of course, you get into the 70s where everything was just hang loose, baby. And we have Godspell and Jesus Christ Superstar. And for some reason, a lot of people are interested in a lost gay porn film called Him. And this book actually has the first known production still from that movie with an actor known as Tava playing Jesus without any clothing, which you have been forewarned. So as we go through time and as situations change and attitudes change, Jesus becomes a reflection of our era. It's in many ways, it's very time sensitive. You look at a film like Godspell, Jesus Christ Superstar, you know they're from the 1970s. You also look at a film like, say, Greatest Story Ever Told, which is a big epic with an all-star cast, and you could tell this came from a specific era in filmmaking when you'd have the wide Cinerama screen and you'd have an all-star cast and Technicolor and incredible production. Going into Mel Gibson's film, Passion of the Christ, then we're already into the 21st century, and if any rules were still around, they were pretty much shredded, and Gibson authored his version in a very dark and bloody version of the Passion. Then some years later, you have a film like The Shack, where Jesus is somewhat like a new age life coach, where he openly says he doesn't believe in religion. So look at the calendar, and you'll find the Jesus to fit the times, at least cinematically.
Yeah, I mean, it's so wild because you're absolutely right. You've got, even just holding up Gibson versus The Shack, and it's like night and day. It's night and day, and there's maybe 10 years between them or something like that. But you've got films like Life of Brian and Godspell and all of these things, and they are so wildly different. Last Temptation of Christ, Passion. It's so crazy. Not crazy is not the right word. It's just so wildly different. And I think you're right in the reflection of the times. You brought up Passion there. I was curious about this. I mean, Passion, of course, is the one that's been the most financially successful.
Yes.
We say something like over $500 million. I think it's 625 million. I think you say in the book.
Yeah, it was the most successful independently produced film.
It's insane. What was it about that film that, in particular, that tapped into the culture? Because there was a huge controversy around it as well at the time.
It tapped into the culture at several levels because Gibson had to produce the film himself because no studio would finance it. What he realized is that there was an audience for faith-based films. That Hollywood at this point had become so secular that the idea of doing a Bible film was totally alien to them. Uh, in that sense, he realized there was an audience that was responsive to this topic, and he basically showed up Hollywood for doing it that way. The fact that he could push the film's contents, the violence against Jesus, the very graphic depiction of the scourging and the crucifixion, that was a reflection, I think, of how our society has become numb to violence. I can't really imagine a film like that being made uh, 10 years earlier, even though there had been very rough, violent films. But something like, by the time we got into the 21st century, and this was already post 9/11, we didn't become used to the violence, but we became numb to it.
Mm.
And the idea of seeing Jesus being physically assaulted to the point where his flesh is being torn off, uh, as a society, we could accept that without being revolted, without demanding the film be taken out of the theaters. Uh, the most unpleasant aspect of Gibson's film really is the anti-Semitic overtones. Uh, Gibson, of course, off screen and away from the film, has gotten into a lot of trouble for running his mouth off, saying anti-Semitic things. But the fact that the film was able to get into theaters with this unapologetic emphasis on the Sanhedrin being responsible for the death of Jesus as opposed to Pilate. Uh, Maybe this was a forerunner of what we're seeing today with a rising level of anti-Semitism within Western society, both in the United States, Canada, and in Europe. The fact that mainstream audiences, predominantly Christian audiences, are not offended that the deicide's being blamed on the Jewish people. There is a line in the film where Caiaphas basically says, "Let his blood be upon us." And Gibson initially agreed to take that out, and he didn't. What he did was he kept it in. The film is in different languages, Hebrew, Latin, and Aramaic, but he removed the English subtitle. So unless you speak one of those languages, you don't know that this is being said. But he insisted on keeping it in, which is a testament to him as an individual, and maybe a testament to the society as a whole for enabling it and just giving it a shrug.
Yeah, I thought that was interesting when you raised that point in the book where you talk about how he left it in, but he took out the subtitles, because it's true. I mean, I had no idea what was said, but of course, I mean, this is a film in Aramaic, I believe, is the language that it's spoken in,
Primarily, yes.
and I mean, it's would have gone entirely over my head at that point. But I think that's a really interesting point. One of the other characters I was really interested in the film, or in the one of the other characters I was really interested in your book, that's briefly mentioned, is Alice Guy. I was wondering if you could talk about her importance, because you seem to suggest that there's a historical importance to her, but her film is sort of washed over by, it's sort of been reclaimed but washed over through history.
Well, her film came out after a flurry of films on the subject. I think that she was one of the last of the French silent films to focus. There was a very big rush starting in the 1890s with Georges Méliès, going into the early 1900s, through the end of the first decade of the 20th century. Guy's film didn't really make an impact with audiences. We have to realize too that Guy's importance in many ways is belated and retrospective, because back in the day, audiences weren't like, "Oh my goodness, there's a woman directing a movie." Audiences didn't think twice about who was behind the camera. They were only interested in what was on the screen. Guy's film had been lost for many years and then was recovered. She's been given a great deal of prominence in film scholarship for her gender. I mean, it sounds cruel, but not so much for the artistic output or the commercial output, but because she was a pioneering female filmmaker in a profession that even today is still woefully underrepresented in terms of gender equality.
Yeah.
Many scholars today are trying to, in my opinion, read more into what she did versus what's actually on the screen. They're taking a very contemporary approach to it. I don't believe that Guy was obsessed over her gender and how that impacted what she was doing, because she was a very successful filmmaker during the early part of the 20th century. It was a very different industry back then, and I think putting contemporary values into what had happened more than a century ago is just going to be a fruitless pursuit.
Yeah, that's fair. And it's interesting too, because that's one of the points that's sort of raised in the book, is how that too is shifted in our portrayals of the stories of Jesus. So, for example, broader diversity included, I think was it Godspell that you talk about? There is more, or you have Godspell held up against
Jesus Christ Superstar.
Jesus Christ Superstar.
Well, what happened with those films, we had a Black Judas in Jesus Christ Superstar, Carl Anderson's performance. The disciples in Jesus Christ Superstar were mixed race. We had whites, blacks, I believe Hispanics. I'm not quite certain about that. Godspell, we had male and female disciples, which was the first time that happened. Fast forward to 2006, we suddenly have two films with a Black Jesus, Son of God, which was made in South Africa, and Color of the Cross, which is an independent film made in California. So we're already starting to move very far away from the traditional concept of the Bible, which had been defined by the paintings of the Renaissance and even the medieval paintings of what Jesus looked like and what the disciples looked like and what Mary looked like. So now the idea that having a Black Jesus, nobody even thinks twice about it. John Legend was on NBC with the telecast of Jesus Christ Superstar, and there wasn't a single review that I'm aware of that mentioned the fact that there was a Black performer as Jesus.
Yeah, and which is great. It's not as wonderful. One of the things that I am really fascinated about in the book is the relationship between the church and cinema, because I think it was Parable in 1975, and where I mean, we just see this constant struggle, especially as stories start to move away from what they're comfortable with. I was wondering if you could talk about that tension and what it has, or how it has affected the films.
Well, Parable actually came out in 1964, and it was first shown at the New York World's Fair.
Right.
It was part of the presentation of the Protestant and Orthodox Pavilion, and your audience may not be aware of it, but the 1964 World's Fair, a number of religious organizations had their own pavilions. Nobody thinks of going to a World's Fair to see a religious pavilion, but the Protestant and the Orthodox faiths shared a pavilion. The Roman Catholic Church had its pavilion. The Pieta was brought from Rome, and actually Pope Paul came after it to visit the World's Fair and to bless the grounds. Billy Graham had his pavilion too, and I'll get to him in a minute. But with Parable, this is a short film, again, a reflection of the 60s, where there are challenges to authority and how things have traditionally been done, which tells a story, as its title would suggest. It is a parable of Jesus' ministry, but we don't have a traditional Jesus. We actually have a silent figure wearing white clown makeup. And many people found that offensive. In fact, there were threats of shutting down the pavilion. Con Edison, the utility for New York City, threatened to turn off the electricity to it. But the controversy actually did the exact opposite. It created more attention and more awareness of that, and people who came to the World's Fair wanted to see Parable. You're going to the World's Fair, and the last thing you'd want to thing to do is to go to the Protestant and Orthodox pavilion, but it drew the crowds in. And it was a different view. Parable was not produced by any church. It was an independent production. The pavilion just agreed to show the movie. Billy Graham, who had his own pavilion, actually produced a film that was shown at the World's Fair as well, called Man in the Fifth Dimension, which is a very clever documentary that directly challenged the notion that religion and science were antithetical and could only exist on parallel tracks. And this was, there have been documentaries obviously on the subject of Jesus, but this was the first, and as far as I know, the only one that dared to take it out of a theological consideration and to show that this is not something that should just be kept on a pedestal away from the rest of the wider world, that it is an integral part of our existence. That was also a very popular film at the World's Fair as well. So I mean, I was not born when the World's Fair opened, so I never got to see the films on the big screen, and particularly Man in the Fifth Dimension, which was shot in Todd AO, which is the big screen 70 millimeter format that was used for Around the World in 80 Days and Cleopatra. So you can find these films on YouTube, which isn't quite the same thing as seeing it on the big screen, but you get an idea of what all the brouhaha was all about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. And and then you go even, I guess it's only 10 or 15 years later, and then you've got Life of Brian, which, by the way, that conversation you mentioned between Michael Palin and Cleese with the thing, it's on YouTube. I don't know if and it is a fascinating back and forth. And it begs the question too, as we start to wrap up. I was just wondering, what is it? I mean, obviously, we're talking, when you talk about the biblical story, it's held in reverence, but there seems to be a fear to be able to laugh at it or even sort of play with it without people getting without causing a ruckus. Though not that there hasn't been, but I was wondering, why is it that we fear that aspect to you?
It's kind of strange because Life of Brian came out in 1979. This was the end of the 70s, which, as I mentioned earlier, was a very loose-limbed decade. And people weren't uptight. And then all of a sudden they became uptight about the film, which actually was not about Jesus, but about somebody who was mistaken for him. And a lot of the people who were protesting the film didn't see it. So,
Yeah.
And I think also this is the beginning of another unpleasant aspect of today's society, is that everybody's become very, very touchy about everything. That if you're trying to offer something in a slightly flippant or irreverent manner, someone's going to come down on you. As they came down on the Monty Python, mercifully, the Pythons were a rather sturdy bunch who gave as good as they got and pushed back with a great deal of humor and a great deal of irony too. Terry Gilliam said that they should actually be congratulated because one of the few vehicles that united Jews, Protestants, and Catholics together against the common enemy, in this case. It's interesting because with Python's film, I'll be honest, when the film came out back when I saw it, and I loved Monty Python and I love the film, watching it again for the book, I don't think it really held up as well. Maybe my memories were a lot more cheerful, or maybe I've become a little bit more cynical as I've gotten older, but it's really not my favorite film. You look back on something like Godspell or even Jesus Christ Superstar, particularly Tim Rice's lyrics, and you could really make an argument these are a lot more offensive intellectually than anything Life of Brian does, because Life of Brian, as I mentioned, Jesus is barely in the film. There's just a very nice mother for Mary, and then later the adult Jesus is giving the Sermon on the Mount, but he's so far away that people can't hear what he's saying, and they're wondering why he's saying "Blessed are the cheesemakers," and that's it. And there's nothing more about it that is specific to Jesus. Again, the outrage today seems so overblown, but it didn't really go away into the 80s. Pope John Paul II got in on the act and condemned Godard's Hail Mary. I don't know if you saw the film, but he decided deserved to be condemned. Last Temptation of Christ also had gotten a lot of picketers outside the theaters, which scared Universal Pictures, and they decided to keep it in a limited release. And I think that may have contributed to the fact that by the time that The Passion was made by Mel Gibson, that Hollywood studios didn't want to touch the subject because they were afraid of offending people. But as I mentioned a few minutes ago, this was already into the post 9/11 era, so people were not going to be offended by Gibson's version of what it is. People still do get offended. There was a film out of Brazil in 2019 that was on Netflix that insinuated Jesus could have been homosexual, and that got a lot of flack down in Brazil. It made no impact in the US because Netflix watchers aren't really on the search for controversial Brazilian movies. But I'm sure if you push the right button or maybe the wrong button, you're going to get a very negative response.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Just as we finish up here, Phil, I was wondering if you have a favorite depiction and a least favorite from your research.
Two favorites. Greatest story ever told for traditional filmmaking. The film has its problems, particularly the all-star cast. It makes it look like it's a mad world where every few minutes a famous face suddenly pops up unexpectedly. But it's a beautifully made film. The cinematography, the costuming, and Max von Sydow's performance, I think, is the best. He looks like an Eastern Orthodox icon come to life. I'm also fond of Johnny Cash's movie from 1973, The Gospel Road, which it's probably the most idiosyncratic film in the genre. It's more of a film essay with some recreations of Jesus' life, but also Cash with his Bible, wandering through the Holy Land, discussing what was written, and there's this beautiful country gospel soundtrack that goes with it. You don't get a lot of country music in biblical films, so that was quite nice. And even having June Carter Cash as Mary Magdalene was a bit of a funky choice, but she sings the song "Follow Me" in the movie, and it's a beautiful rendition, so I like that. My least favorite is a movie that was made in Detroit under the title "The Greatest Story Overtold." It was made in 1971. It got released in New York theatrically in 1974 as The Divine Mr. J. And it had that title because Bette Midler was in the film before she became famous. She played a none too virginal Mary. And the film is a typical 70s underground comedy, a lot of bad taste, a lot of juvenile toilet humor. Bette Midler's Mary apparently is tricked by a rabbi who pretends to be the angel Gabriel, and he pimps her out. That's the kind of humor it is. It's a painful movie to watch because the people on camera and behind think they are the funniest things in the world, and they're not. And if you don't believe me, go to YouTube, look for a movie called The Thorn, because that was the VHS video title that they gave to the movie when it went out on home video. Mercifully, it didn't get a very wide release either theatrically or on home video because Bette Midler's lawyers stepped in and stopped it. So it's out there if you want to see it, but why would you want to see it?
There you go. I mean, why bother? Honestly, Phil, I thought it was a really fascinating book. It's very well researched, and there's lots. I knew that it was an extensive, the Jesus film genre was extensive. I had no idea how extensive.
Neither did I. It took 2 years to research, and even when the book was ready to go, I was still adding things to it that I hadn't found. So it was both a labor of love and a labor.
Yeah, it's wonderful, and it's available, like you said, on Amazon and at Target.
And at Target, Walmart, Barnes & Noble. Also, Bear Manor Media is my publisher. You can go directly to their website and order it from there. Just do the search Jesus Christ Movie Star Phil Hall, and you're bound to find it.
I'll also add the link to the description as well, so if they want to click to that. Thank you so much for chatting with me. This has been a joy. I really do appreciate it. Thanks so much, Phil.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.
All right. Have a great day.
Don't worry, like you never stopped.